my name's Christy Newman. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a professor at the Centre for Social Research in Health, Deputy Dean Research in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture, and co-lead of the Community of Practice for Inclusive Research with queer and trans people and people with variations of sex characteristics, which is a new group in the university, which we'll tell you a little bit about after this. I'm also co-editor of the handbook that you'll hear a little bit about today, and I'm the chair of this event. As chair of this event, I'd like to acknowledge the Bedegal people, the traditional custodians of the land that the UNSW Kensington campus was built on, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. You may have noticed we're meeting here in a building called the Old Main Building. It's one of the oldest structures on the campus. It's something like 75 years old. And this building houses the School of Physics, where some of the world's leading physicists are breaking new theoretical and empirical experimental ground, from silicon quantum computing, which is just at the end over there, to astroseismology, which is a discipline I didn't know about. And as I pay my respects to the elders of the traditional custodians of this unceded Bedegal land, I also reflect on the strengths, resourcefulness, and deep connection to country that First Nations people have demonstrated in every colonised setting, in continuing to care for country, maintain language and law, and protect knowledge systems in the face of centuries of violence, dispossession, and dehumanisation. And in this place, these strengths have sustained the world's oldest continuously living culture for more than 70,000 years, including knowledge systems developed over that time that now resonate deeply with these newfangled ways of thinking about space, time, and matter that are being troubled over in this building today. I also extend my respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us today in person or online. We do have a lot of people online. Thanks for joining us. And I want to show you this artwork, which is by Leilani Tallulah Knight, a Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi queer artist and Bachelor of Fine Arts student from my faculty, who designed this artwork for our first Indigenous strategy in 2021. Leilani says that this work, which is entitled "You Gonna Listen Now," speaks to her university experience and its influence on her identity as a queer Indigenous artist. She says, at its heart, this piece truly reflects the resilience of Indigenous cultures and is a beacon to centre community and healing at the centre of institutional policies. So I wanted to thank Leilani for helping us start this seminar today by recognising also the tensions and the intersections between Indigenous and queer justice movements today. So we are celebrating the publication of the second edition of the Routledge Handbook of Sexuality, Gender, Health and Rights. The first edition was published in 2010, is that correct? Yes. Edited by Peter Aggleton, who we have here, and Richard Parker, and is one of Routledge's best-selling handbooks. Very wide range of readers in universities and beyond. So in 2019, Routledge approached Peter again to produce an updated version, given so many changes in these areas that happened since that time. And new editors were invited to join the team: Carmen Logie in Toronto, Rob Cover, who we have here tonight, and myself, feeling very blessed to be invited to be part of this group. And together we looked at what still resonated from that edition, where the gaps were in content representation and in social generational contributions. And we started commissioning new work from a really exciting range of new contributors from around the world, including 3 from Australia and New Zealand who are here with us today. And I will introduce them in a moment. The 7 sections here organise 48 chapters, and 30 of those are new. Please reach out if you're interested in learning more about any of these. And a quick shout out to some other local contributors who I know are online today. Emerita Professor Raywin Connell, who wrote chapter 7 on the making of a sociology of gender and sexuality. Dr. Morgan Carpenter, who wrote chapter 10 on the health and human rights of people with intersex variations. Associate Professor Sarah Bernays and Dr. Joni Lariat, who wrote chapter 39 on innovation in HIV prevention technologies. I will wrap it up there. There are many more wonderful people. But before I go on any further, I want to make absolutely clear, this is not a book launch. It's a panel discussion, but it's a panel discussion focused on a question that resonates across all of the handbook chapters, which is, what sustains commitment to advancing and protecting social justice in relation to sex, gender, and sexuality. I'm going to read a very short quote from the first page of the handbook to set the scene for this discussion. We wrote, "Where once there was recognition and celebration of openness, contextuality, and diversity, there is now closure. What started as conservative opposition to new identities, practices, and relationships has now been transformed into fully fledged gender wars, continued state-sanctioned homophobia and transphobia, and the criminalisation of anything seen to threaten cisgender identities, heterosexual relationships, and their shared roots in patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism. However, as is inevitable when peoples and communities are marginalised or oppressed, there is contestation and resistance, making it difficult to turn back the clock on progress made with respect to gender and sexuality diversity and social justice." So I'm going to hand over to Peter and Rob first, who are going to provide a few comments and reflections on what has changed in that time and also what sustains commitment from their perspective to progress in these fields. So first up, we have our lead editor, Peter Aggleton, who is a professor who has worked on issues of gender, sexuality, and sexual health for many years and holds senior professorial positions at ANU, UCL, and UNSW. Peter also led the introduction chapter of the handbook from which I just quoted.
Thanks, Christy, and thank you everyone for being here is it this evening, this afternoon? Anyway, thank you for being here and having me with you. As Christy's explained, I work in several different places. People say, which one is the real one? I'm not going to answer that question. I just work in several different places, sometimes in London, sometimes in Canberra, sometimes here in Sydney, depending on what it is that needs to be done. I'm a gay man. Well, maybe you guessed that already, but I was one of the first academics in the UK to come out as gay. In the 1980s, in fact, it was quite some time ago. At that time, I worked in the School of Education at a university in Bristol in southwest England, where I was head of education policy studies. So that's a bit about my background in the 1980s. The 1980s were a terrible time for lots of us. The UK government, led by Margaret Thatcher, had just passed legislation called Section 28 of the 1988 Local Authorities Act, which had attempted to ban local authorities from promoting and publishing material on homosexuality as a pretended family relationship in any school. So that was their effort in the 1980s. And AIDS, of course, was being reported at about the same time with increasing frequency in that country and in other countries too. And there was debate about its cause. There wasn't any effective treatment. And of course, there was no cure. So coming out at that time was not easy. In fact, within a few days of my being known to be a gay member of staff, a deputation from other tutors and lecturers at that same university approached my head of school, asking whether it was appropriate for a gay man to be employed in teacher education. After all, there were innocent children involved. And what about AIDS? Children don't need to know about these things so early in life. And what would their parents think? Luckily, my head of school had some principles and tersely replied that this was exactly why there should be gay people involved in teacher education. And children, since future young people and adults were the very ones who needed to know about gender and sexuality and HIV. Now, many of my colleagues were not so fortunate. They didn't have people to protect them or to speak out on their behalf. And indeed, the legacy of Section 28 continues. There are still teachers in the UK and elsewhere who are frightened to address the issues that we know must be addressed. And that's true here in Australia as well as in the UK. But why this story? And what's its relevance to this evening's theme? The theme is radical imaginations and critical hope, sustaining progress in sexuality, gender, health, and rights. There are many reasons why, but central among them is the need to constantly resource and sustain hope in difficult times. For myself and many others at that time, books, meetings, actions, public demonstrations were just one way or several ways of doing it. Books were very important in particular because they had an authority and a permanence that was made them central to the struggles that many of us were involved with at that time. Now, we know that there aren't such things as books now in many of our lives, or at least if they are books, they're not the solid objects that they used to be. They're things that we access online in a range of other environments, but that doesn't mean they're any less important. In particular, what they do, it seems to me, is three things. They alert us to what the issues are for those that were ignored, and those who've been cancelled, and those who've been excluded. They show us to others and to ourselves. They help us think best about these issues if they're well written and they're carefully considered. And I think they provide us with insight into how to organize both in the present time and for the future. So I think, and I know that there are fewer books in universities nowadays, especially in their libraries, it seems, in some cases, but they have an important function, an important purpose. And that, I suppose, is why this book may be useful in some contexts, to some people some other time. But hearing directly from some of the contributors to the book is the most important thing. Not just editing them and putting them together. It's actually hearing those words spoken by the people who are responsible for creating them. And for the rest of this evening, and from ourselves more collectively, we hope to hear some of those voices. So at that moment, I think I will just thank Christy, Rob, and Carmen, Richard, the other members of the team who helped put the book together, and also, of course, all of our authors, many of whom are online at this particular moment in time. Thank you.
And I'm now going to introduce Professor Rob Kober, who, as we've heard, is another of the editors of this handbook and Professor of Digital Communication at RMIT, co-director of the RMIT Digital Ethnography Research Centre. And he and I also wrote a chapter in the handbook, Chapter 12 on gender and sexuality identity in social media and everyday life, the expansion and redefinition of non-binary gender and bisexuality, which is an excellent one.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Peter. Look, I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about, I suppose, a little about the experience of being involved in the editorial team of the second edition. When Peter and Richard invited me on board, I was, I think, petrified at first, as well as incredibly delighted and thrilled and excited. Petrified because the 2010 edition had been such an important handbook for me at the time, around 2011, 2012, when I was doing a lot of work on queer youth suicide in particular. It was the kind of book that sat on my desk wherever I was and was constantly referenced. And so frightened at the idea of, well, what more is there to do? Is the first edition not enough? It was an interesting opportunity to really reflect for me on what has changed in the nearly 15 years between the original edition and what we were working on. What are the things that we need to think about that are happening socially, culturally, in our media sphere and so on? I mean, I've got three, really. I think that there were probably 1,000 more things that actually the book reflects, but these are the three that were certainly the most significant for me. One is the very, very significant shift in gender and sexual subjectivity, identity, knowledge frameworks, and so on from about 2015, 2016, when we saw a mass proliferation of identities, subjectivities, new ways of talking about and thinking about gender that pretty much smashed the binary frameworks that we were so useful and that had done so much organizing for belonging and non-belonging and so on for such a long time. So hundreds of new terms, hundreds of new identities and labels, hundreds of new ways of thinking an authentic self that emerged out of the gaps of people who've been very much forgotten in the more traditional binary framework. And the fact that it spiraled out, starting pretty much in, well, hard to trace where it really begins, but Tumblr is often sort of pointed to as one of the settings, and spiraling out. It's not just an online thing, it's very much in our real lives and everyday life. But it's also part of everyday mainstream popular culture as well. Yesterday, ABC ran a story on autosexual identity, which and described it as a new sexual identity that hasn't been well discussed yet. Apparently, autosexuality is where you are sexually attracted more to yourself than to any other person, any other body as well. which I thought was actually most boys, but maybe it's not. Perhaps it is a discrete identity of its own. But the fact that the ABC could run a story like this when 5-6 years ago, they shunned the idea that, you know, that non-binary was a legitimate way of living one's gender or experiencing one's gender. But this is a very, very substantial change. Now, we've been, in a way, trying to make those kinds of changes for a long time, predating the 60s, 70s, right throughout the 20th century. There've always been artists, scholars, avant-garde, bohemian perspectives that attempted to play with fluidity, with new ways of thinking gender and so on. But these never really took, and in a popular way, until more recently. And that's something that, you know, it's trying to unpack that and understand this shift and see where it goes and let it fix culturally is potentially one of the most positive things that we can actually see. You know, it's not entirely always positive. It does create new ways of doing exclusion as well, and that is being experienced. But being able to track it, and I think in a way, a lot of the chapters in the volume do track this in many ways. Travis Solway's work on two-spirited perspectives, Morgan Carpenter's on the changing framework of intersex belonging, Zach Schudson on digital discourses of intersectionality. You know, Christy and myself tried to explore some of the ways in which bi identities shift into a bi plus framework, and the extent to which that might be a response also to non-binary thinking and the complex configurations that are at play. And a host of other authors across the volume are all attending to, I think, what we called in one of the section headings, the changing choreographies of sexuality, and changing choreographies of gender, changing choreographies of selfhood, quite like the choreography of the dance that is actually played culturally. And the second, really quickly, is the change in digital communication frameworks that often the marker that is used is the internet, and that's not really very, very useful at all. You know, the internet of the 1990s in its uptake is very, very different from our digital communication frameworks now. And it's done many positive things and many, many terrible things to the setting, and that many of which are described in the volume. I mean, in some very positive ways, the collective intelligence of online communication allowed dispersed voices to actually be heard and to configure new languages, such as those new languages of identity. But at the same time, what we really see is what is not the effect of the early 1990s or even the development of social media in 2004, 2005, about half a decade before the first volume, but the embedding of the traffic model of digital platforms that we see today, which has brought and encouraged so much disinformation, online abuse, doxing, the use of deepfakes, and the host of other new emergences that we really need to not combat, but adapt to and possibly struggle against as well. And and some of those are very, very significant because they're driving part of what is the problem for the third element, the question of progress. Is there progress in social justice now, or are we actually facing new justice challenges? Certainly, I think we are the latter, very substantial justice challenges that require a lot of new ways of thinking. I'm using the phrase, I'm stealing from Claire Eagleton, hope without optimism. Optimists believe that progress is automatic in general, and I don't think we should be optimistic because this is not what we're seeing. The call out against the emergent gender framework or against trans people, the banning of books that might vaguely hint at someone transitioning. I don't know who these right-wing arch conservatives are. They seem to be more adept at reading into books than queer theorists were in the 1990s. So they're certainly seeing things that I'm not picking up. They're doing a good job of making sure that these are bannable books. So it's the part of the work here that's really needed is embracing what young people are doing in particular, and the assertion of a right to an authentic identity, an authentic way of speaking about the self, but also in collaboration with the humanities and social sciences, which, you know, in particular are continuing to try to do good work to ensure that adaptation and change happens quite smoothly. And of course, obviously, the kinds of activism that, you know, many of us, I know in this room, many of the authors are involved in or have been involved in, or, you know, continue to be involved in different ways across different parts of life, you know, which is, you know, a necessary component trying to ensure that, you know, we don't move backwards in this onslaught that we're actually in now. So look, I'll end on that rather dismal note, but, you know, I think somewhat hopeful and hopefully so.
I'm going to introduce the first of our three chapter authors, and we're going in order in the chapters in the handbook. So the first one is Dr. Sujith Kumar Prankumar, who is a senior research associate at the Kirby Institute here at UNSW, and who completed his PhD at the Centre for Social Research and Health a couple of years ago. Sujith wrote chapter 11 with two co-authors, who I think you might mention, and it was entitled Living Under the Shadow of the Law, Sexual Citizenship and Belonging in Singapore.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me? So I speak in like 75 different accents, but after these three giants, I'd be grateful if I can sound human. So good evening, everyone. Singapore and Australia both inherited harsh anti-sodomy laws from the British during colonization. In Australia, decriminalization began in South Australia in 1975 and was progressively realized, not without struggle, across the other states and territories over a 22-year period. Marriage equality was only enacted at the federal level 20 years after that in 2017. In Singapore, decriminalization happened amongst male same-sex sexual activity slightly more than 16 months ago, somewhere in December 2022. So it's been fairly recent. In this short paper based on a chapter in the handbook, we use a sexual citizenship lens to explore the experiences of sexuality and gender diverse individuals living in Singapore and Australia. Broadly speaking, a sexual citizenship lens takes sexuality as linked with citizenship and belonging in ways that influence our participation in society. We argue that while sexual citizenship can be promoted through legal recognition, it has no fixed or stable endpoint. This is because progress has unequal effects, and remaining inequalities continue to have broad consequences, including within the domains of housing, health, and welfare services. This means that decriminalization or marriage equality cannot be taken as the end goal. Rather, they represent the introduction of new turbulences into the system, indicating a degree of progress, while at the same time marking new exclusions along the lines of gender, ethnicity, class, and geography. These turbulences can often be productive. Here, we could learn from quantum field theory, which considers the universe as probabilistic rather than deterministic, where fundamental matter is transient rather than discrete, and where a vacuum is not empty but filled with quantum fluctuations, or potentiality. Thinking of citizenship as a speculative position that makes space for and nurtures the noisy multiplicities of queer life, rather than as a discrete state, casts citizenship as a superposition, or as a range of possibilities rather than as a fixed entity with rigid definitions about who does or does not belong. There's also value in paying attention to liberation theology, which takes as its starting position a divinely held preferential option for the poor, where suffering and the experience of rejection reveal profound truths. This epistemic privileging of marginalized voices could, in practice, reveal and amplify the noisy multiplicities of queer life that result from the defiance of heteronormative ideologies and interlocking systems of domination. Such systems include colonial dispossession, militarism, ethno-nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and anthropocentrism, which give rise to violence in various forms, including queerphobia, racism, and ecocide. These entangled systems of domination are broadly implicated in the erasure and subjugation of queer people, the negation of self-determination, and the refusal or inability to consider queer people as fully human. Beyond this, considering heteronormative ideologies as linked to other forms of dominance calls for a more comprehensive understanding of flourishing and the need to avoid the pitfall of queer progress being co-opted to cover other forms of oppression. One example of this is the phenomenon of pinkwashing, which US academic Jasbir Puar developed in her book, Terrorist Assemblages. Pinkwashing refers to a situation where the notion of queer rights is exploited to distract from or to justify human rights violation. One example is Israel's appropriation of queer rights to promote itself as a progressive modern democracy and to deflect from, and hide the reality of its decades-long violent military occupation. Such a strategy has insidiously functioned to fracture progressive solidarity movements and has made it extremely difficult or even dangerous for queer Palestinians to safely advocate for their basic rights, much less survive. Naming the problem and achieving legal change are important first steps towards supporting social inclusion. However, liberal notions of rights or citizenship often fail to acknowledge the chaotic potential of difference and multiple visions of flourishing. For example, in the studies discussed in our chapter, some minority ethnic participants in Australia felt little change in their sexual citizenship even after the passage of marriage equality, because they were more concerned with housing and employment insecurity, transphobia, and racism, and could not imagine marriage within their cultural context. In Singapore, participants spoke about systemic challenges with housing, employment, and relationship recognition, with minority ethnic participants, in this case, those who were not Chinese Singaporeans, experiencing further barriers to inclusion based on race and ethnicity. Ultimately, realizing sexual citizenship requires progress and change across multiple domains of life, not just in relation to one of these domains, no matter how significant that may be. However, despite these challenges, every participant in the Australian study felt actively optimistic for their future, mainly due to their confidence that their basic health and social security needs would be met, and because they knew they were legally included in the fold of citizenship, even if precariously. In contrast, participants in Singapore, despite appreciating their basic material conditions, felt they had little to look forward to in terms of building their own relationships and families, and often felt that their only purpose in life was to contribute to the state's economic development. From this, we see that the struggle for sexual citizenship cannot be compartmentalized or detached from broader struggles for justice. We also see how legal change can facilitate flourishing, although it frequently ignores the interrelatedness of the societal structures in which we live. The law has a propensity to violently eliminate difference. Envisioning full sexual citizenship requires a radical hopefulness, one that celebrates the productive force of difference, that fuels our fight against systemic oppression, that allows us to disrupt rigid categorizations, and that enables both reciprocity and solidarity across justice movements. Thank you.
And now we are going to hopefully hear from Alex. Yep, there is Alex, fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to Alex Kerr, who is a doctoral candidate based at Te Herenga Whaka. I'm probably going to get that pronunciation terrible. Alex wrote chapter 41 entitled Achieving Trans Pregnancy and Parenthood, the Impacts of Cisnormativity on Trans People's Reproductive Autonomy.
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be able to join virtually from across the seas in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm currently in the land or the whenua of Te Aotearoa and Taranaki Whanui, who are the iwi or the people of the land here. So I acknowledge and mihi to them. It's a really awesome occasion to be part of, and it's thank you for the opportunity to speak to the chapter that I contributed to this wonderful handbook. As you can see, my chapter was, I was hoping to make visible the ways in which cisnormativity, or in other words, the beliefs and assumptions that center non-trans and non-binary people, how they operate to leave little room for trans people to know and consider their reproductive options. So that includes things like conception, fertility, pregnancy, parenthood, abortion, family formations. I think for those of us who are trans, cisnormativity is, we are highly attuned to it. It's very pervasive in many aspects of our lives. And I think particularly in the context of reproduction, which is arguably one of the most gendered human experiences, it feels everywhere. It's in the healthcare systems that we encounter when we're trying to seek reproductive and sexual healthcare. It's in the assumptions even before we enter those healthcare settings, where we, I think a lot of us have historically assumed deeply that, or been told or internalized the belief that we as trans people cannot reproduce or that we should not reproduce. And I think these are really deeply embedded and often, sometimes even for trans people, sort of taken as a given or unquestioned. And I think that speaks to how deeply embedded these norms are within our reproductive discourses. So I was trying to make visible the ways in which cisnormativity operates to limit trans people's reproductive autonomy. I think it's also really evident in our research priorities. I think historically, because we haven't focused on understanding how gender affirming healthcare impacts fertility, and we're seeing that more and more now, which is great. But historically, we're still catching up to the lack of evidence base that then informs, reproductive healthcare provision. So I think there's a lot of systemic gaps that we're currently seeing being filled, and I think that's something that's really exciting to see that momentum happening. Beyond healthcare settings, of course, cisnormativity is embedded in our cultural and our legal systems as well. And that, of course, can also impact how trans people imagine their reproductive futures, how they can be legally and socially recognized as parents or pregnant people. And so much of the language when we talk and think about reproduction is incredibly gendered, which can also be sort of a discursive barrier. But I think beyond the sort of, talking about the failures and the deficit, I really want to focus the next few minutes on what brings me hope and what brings people around me hope, and thinking and imagining what a potentially different future might be like for trans and non-binary people when thinking about what's possible for them, for their bodies, for their healthcare, for their gender affirmation in relation to things like conceiving, becoming pregnant, and giving birth and creating families. And I think there are two things that come to mind when I think about what gives me hope. I think because of the failures of systems to provide options or representation of what and how trans people can create families and children of their own. I think what we're seeing is trans people sharing their lived experiences, and I think this is, facilitated so well by social media and other platforms where trans people can have their agency to tell their stories, their lived realities, their highs and lows in their journeys of creating families through biological reproduction. I think that's often a source of information and knowledge, and provides people with hope where they haven't seen that otherwise. And secondly, I think, and although I sort of focus on cisnormativity in this chapter, which can feel like quite a sort of single issue way of thinking about reproductive autonomy, I do want to highlight that the work towards achieving trans reproductive justice and autonomy is so intertwined and inseparable from all the other ways in which we're working towards reproductive justice for everyone. And I think a lot of the time we get focused, our discussions are so much focused on language and semantics, and of course the concerns that, talking about or creating additive and neutral language will erase other people's experiences, particularly for cis women. I think rather than focusing there, I think we need to focus on and recognize that the ground that we're all these paths towards reproductive justice on, we're actually sharing that same ground. And so I think what needs to sustain the work for reproductive justice is to recognize those common values. And that comes down to self-determination, to bodily autonomy, to accurate information. I think there's a lot of misinformation as well around trans fertility in particular that needs to be addressed. And treating people with respect. I think it comes down to these really human values at the end of the day. And I think for some people that change may be uncomfortable and uncertain. There are still a lot of unanswered questions, particularly for people medically affirming their gender and reproducing. So there's so much work to be done. I think it requires us getting used to talking about trans bodies. being okay with being uncomfortable or uncertain about things. But I think the most important thing is not to let those unknowns create barriers for us moving forward. I think we need to sit with those uncertainties and those questions that we still have, which can be difficult, but I think necessary. So that sort of leaves me wondering, and I hope this sort of offers some catalyst for you as well to think about. So what would be different if our systems and practices and services around reproductive health started from a place of recognizing and welcoming difference, of not assuming, of starting from a place that embraced that uncertainty. And also, I think a crucial part of this is listening to trans people and acknowledging their embodied knowledge, their desires, maybe their desires not to have kids. Maybe, I think we need to listen to trans people more and always center their voices and experiences within this, whether that's in interpersonal sort of interactions, but also systemically. How do we center trans people's voices and also bodies in that? Yeah, and I think as was mentioned earlier, I think what we really need to do is future-proof our reproductive systems and discourses, because our younger generations are thinking and talking about bodies and sex and gender in a really different ways. And I think we need to listen to what they're saying and to make sure that these systems are ready for people who are going to be coming through. And we're seeing more and more people, pregnant trans people and queer families accessing services and achieving their reproductive autonomy, which is really exciting. And we need to make sure they're supported by those systems as well. So thank you for listening, and yeah, thanks.
And I'm going to welcome our last speaker, Dr. Zara Stardust, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the ARC Centre for Automated Decision Making and Society at UUT. Not so long ago, a PhD candidate also at UNSW, and her PhD research has now been published as a book by Duke University Press, out now in November, so close, called Indie Porn. Get your do your pre-orders. Zara wrote chapter 45 in the handbook, which was called Sex Tech in an Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Design, Data, and
Hi, thank you so much, Christy. It's so wonderful to be here and to see everybody and to hear all of these really important presentations. It's a real privilege to be part of this book. I want to also acknowledge the Bedegal people, in addition to the Turrbal and the Yagara people in Meanjin, where I work, and the Wurundjeri Bara and the Yugambeh people where I live. Let's recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. Tonight, we're thinking about sustaining progress in gender, sexuality, health, and rights. And this concept of progress reminded me of a book that you might have heard of called The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in post-capitalist ruins by Anna Tsing. And in that book, Anna writes about how many of us were raised on dreams of progress and improvement and modernization. And these stories are like replete in all our surroundings through this promise of science, through the narrative of hope, through tales about growth. And we're taught that precarity is an exception to how the world works. But as Tsing suggests, precarity is the condition of our time, with rising seas, with species extinction, global poverty, with genocide. Precarity is everywhere, and it's unrelenting. The industry of sex tech is an example of the narrative of progress that Tsing talks about. Its marketing language is full of momentum, promises of optimization and innovation. The rapidly growing market for sex tech is forecast to become a $122 billion market, and reports are that it's growing at a faster rate than drone manufacturing. Sex tech, by which I mean a very diverse range of products, from sex therapy apps and sex education chatbots to biometric vibrators and virtual companions, is a space where startups thrive, where passions collide, where something sexy and something techie is happening. And sexual wellness has been described as the next blue ocean for tech entrepreneurs and investors. But if we look historically at sex tech, it's not simply about enhancing pleasure and sexuality. Sexual devices, family planning, sterilization, sexual data collection have been forms of biopolitical management, population control, eugenics throughout the 19th and 20th century, from airport scanners, body scanners to nudity classifiers to genetic embryo screening. Technologies continue to be deployed to discipline queer, trans, intersex, racialized, disabled, and fat bodies. And sex tech does the work of state control and corporate surveillance. The involvement of sexologists, clinicians, medical professionals in designing sex tech means that it often focuses on dysfunction, on correcting bodies into particular alignments, and measuring and quantifying performance through a lens of individual pathology. In an age of surveillance capitalism, where user data is extracted and monetized at scale, there remain real risks where abortion or same-sex activity or HIV or sex work remain criminalized. And over the last few years, we've seen hookup apps, vibrator companies, menstrual tracking apps be fined or settled large consumer cases because they've been non-consensually collecting or sharing user data with third parties. It's also a time where police are pushing for back-channel access to social media, and platforms are increasingly requiring biometric verification and authentication of users. So sex tech has this potential to increase profiling and discrimination. So against this backdrop, what relationship does sex tech have with progress, and what does the future of sex tech hold? And in thinking about this, I keep returning to this book by Bo Ruberg called Sex Dolls at Sea, The Imagined Histories of Sexual Technologies. And in the book, they argue that the future of sex tech requires us to be mindful of its history, whose bodies and pleasures are seen as central and whose stories are erased. And in the book, Ruberg specifically focuses on the story of the sex doll and this romantic, nostalgic story that these makeshift dolls that were made of cloth or leather and filled with cotton or straw were used by European sailors in their long, lonely voyages. But as they point out, the imaginary of the sailor is a colonial one of European imperialism and Orientalism, that these nautical trips and the boom in vulcanized rubber goods relied on colonial violence and the exploitation of Indigenous peoples. Ruberg also notes that the popular accounts of the history of sex dolls often overlook stories about people using them in prison, or the tale that Nazi leaders invented the blow-up doll for use by German troops, because these stories don't feature a good sex tech consumer as imagined by industry. They don't fit with this popular narrative of apolitical pleasure and progress. So we need to reckon with these histories before we can even imagine sex tech futures. And thinking about futures, if we look to Aboriginal scholars and crypt theorists, they tell us that the existing imaginaries about the futures are often insufficient or problematic. Professor Bronwyn Carlson writes that although science fiction is meant to make possible radical alternatives, in sci-fi genres, settler narratives are myopic. Indigenous people are imagined as part of the past, but never part of the future. And she demonstrates that we need to look towards Indigenous futurism in storytelling, art, and activism. Similarly, disability activist Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasina writes in her book, The Future is Disabled, that in science fiction utopias, it's often presumed that disabled people have simply been fixed or genetically screened out. And yet with disabling events and environments from pandemics to prisons to war to genocide, we need crypt skills. We need to imagine what futures look like where the vast majority of people are disabled or neurodivergent or deaf or mad. Over the last few years, I've been doing research with Kath Aubrey, Jenny Kennedy, and Yanni Sundan about social justice sex tech. We conducted a public interest sex tech hackathon, and we're currently doing interviews and focus groups with LGBTQ sex tech users and retailers. And part of this has involved using a set of tarot cards called the Oracle Cards for Transfeminist Tech. And they've been a tool to spark conversations about what are shared values for future technologies. And this kind of speculative imagining work has been really generative in making a space for participants to let go of oppressive or carceral or colonial logics and think, what does it mean to design radical liberatory sex tech futures? And there's some really generative, exciting work happening around the world where people are creating anti-surveillance sex tech, Organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League in the US run drag versus AI workshops where users are invited to drag the system through makeup accessories and props designed to confuse facial recognition technologies. Colleagues like Kate Devlin, who have run sex tech hackathons in the UK, have described a turn to abstraction over humanistic hyperrealism, where sex participants have created sex robots that are neither human nor gendered, instead focusing on sensory experience. Sasha Costanza-Chock maps out principles for design justice, how to build sustainable, non-exploitative, community-led and controlled technologies. And activists like Afsana Rego have set out a process for design at the margins that centers the most impacted users. So I think the future is here, the tools are available, and now the question for us is, how do we put sex tech to use, to the task of serving an agenda for sexual health, rights, and
My goodness, we've covered so much in that time. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much to our speakers, to all 5 people who've contributed today. So yes, thank you. And look, before we run out of time, I just want to also thank Issy, who's been running around and helping and coordinating everything. Thank you so much. And the Community of Practice that I've mentioned, who've helped support this event and made it possible for us to do this as not a book launch. So thank you, everybody. So I wanted to ask a question about hope. There is so much to discourage us, and I think we've seen in each of the comments that we've heard tonight, engagement with deeply concerning challenges and struggles. So in that context, I want to read another quote, also from the introduction, but from the end of it, which is about how we might sustain hope. Global histories of resistance and current social change movements can inspire and guide us in ongoing struggles for freedom and liberation in relation to sex, gender, and sexuality. And as part of this process, critical hope has a key role to play. The Brazilian writer and educationalist Paulo Freire, I'm going to again mispronounce that was okay, considered the importance of hope in struggles for social justice, conceptualizing it as a concrete imperative, whereby even if hope alone may not be enough to transform the difficulties we confront, it is essential to sustain us in seeking justice. And the Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks also viewed hope as fuel for social justice and stressed the need to retain hope and avoid cynicism in struggles against oppression. As she once put it, when we only name the problem, when we state complaint without a constructive focus on resolution, we take away hope. In this way, critique can become merely an expression of profound cynicism, which then works to sustain, dominate a culture. I would love to know if anyone has anything that they'd like to add to that thinking about how to sustain hope, critical hope in these times.
Thank you so much, Christy. I really love this quote by Bell Hooks because it's so clear that critique is not enough. And at the same time, ignorant optimism is not useful. And the way things are going, you know, humans are not going to leave this planet a habitable destination for our descendants or our animal friends. Things are imploding and they're only getting worse. And I think science fiction often imagines the apocalypse as this like abstract event at some point in the future. But for many people in the world right now, the apocalypse is this moment. And I often think about this quote by Angela Davis, which is, you have to act as if it's possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I think that's really useful and instructive for me, like, because the antidote to apathy is action. And for all of us, I think it's about finding like what is the way that we can serve our social movements with the skills that we have, whether it's our time or our networks or our bodies or our information, our education. What is the place that we have in social movements, because there is no other alternative. The time is now.
I'll just quickly second Zara's important comment, because hope is difficult in these times. A lot of the work that I do at the moment is on online abuse and digital hostility, and a lot of that is directed towards, in particular, trans and gender diverse people. what's really alarming is that there seem to be quite a lot of people, not just in Florida, but worldwide, but hell of a lot in Florida, who are able to spend the entirety of their day writing literally tens of thousands of hate speech words in forums and X's, excretions, whatever they're called now, all over online. So it does look hopeless. One of the moments of hope for me, though, really is in seeing the call out that's done right, the call out that's not abuse in return, but artistic, engaging, and thoughtful from lived experience. And and this comes from people of all age groups, all over, and having to remember that this is a form of activism that is actually at play. It's only one tiny small part, and it may change one person's mind only, but we do actually see it happen if we track it. It's difficult and complex, but it's like that's one of those moments of hope that I think is at play. So finding the moments where hope actually exists, in order not to become cynical, otherwise that's all we will do.
Hi there. My name's Tidge. I use the pronouns they, them. I work for Pride in Health and Wellbeing at ACON. And I just wanted to add to the conversation that I think an important point to remember with this is hope is contagious, right? We hear a lot about how the LGBT community or any minority community relies on resilience, but we also relies on contagious hope. So when we hear that someone has changed a system in whether it's healthcare, whether it's in employment law, whether it's in social justice, all of a sudden we start to imagine the possibility that can happen in the arena we're working in or we're advocating in. So I think it's a very important part of us sustaining that, forward movement and, camaraderie is to actually look and share those successes that we have and go, look, there is things happening. I have the pleasure of working with, 42 organizations who are trying to make sure LGBTQ inclusion is at the forefront of person-centered inclusive delivery for service delivery. So, share those moments.
Yeah, I think friendship, that's such a huge source of hope, right? Like it's it gives texture to the lived experiences of people, but also allows us to challenge and explore possibilities within the multiplicities in which we are sort of entangled. I look around in this room and I see, just people who care, people who clearly love what they do, who care about each other, who are in community, who take the time to come out to just, on a rainy day to chill with a bunch of people they probably never met, or, and so on and so forth. And I think that's what gives me hope, to know that we still choose to show up despite whatever is happening around us. And if you look at activist circles and so on and so forth, it's, desolate and despondence and et cetera. But you see this sense of joy and gratitude for, sharing flesh and sharing bread with someone else in front of you. And you don't need to know their names, but you know that your hearts beat for something bigger than yourself.
Thank you, Sujit. That was incredible. Alex, yes, please.
I just wanted to quickly add to that, maybe just to expand on what I talked about a little bit in terms of thinking about trans reproduction. I think the very act of, firstly, doing things as a trans person that you've been told that you can't do or that you shouldn't do, I think seeing that represented is a big source of hope for other trans and non-binary people, whether that is having a child or whether that's accessing gender affirming healthcare. When there are these increasing limits, I think seeing people who defy those and by way of existing are disrupting the status quo, I think that's really hopeful. I think there's also something hopeful about the act of reproducing in a time where I think, politically, environmentally, existentially, the future is really uncertain. I was talking to my friend the other day about this and talking about my personal sort of thoughts on, reproduction, having a family, and the uncertainty of the future. And she shared the perspective that, having a child for her would be a great source of hope because you can instill values or things into that next generation. So yeah, just thought I'd add a few of those points. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone who contributed today, everyone, as Sujit said, who came out tonight on a rainy Thursday afternoon to the campus. Thank you, and for joining online. The recording will be available and sent to everybody who's registered. And please come along to future events also. Thank you, everybody.